Okay, so today we're going to look at complementarity. The notes are already uploading this, so really what this is just to talk you through, because we don't have class on Wednesday. Now, with complementarity, it takes us nicely into transitional justice, and the reason for that is that complementarity is focusing on how the ICC is to negotiate its relationship with states. And so there's a number of theorizations around what actually is complementarity, negative, positive, or other views. My own perception is I'll be trying to promote victim-orientated complementarity. I'll also speak today about the rule for other actors, and this presentation was actually built on a workshop I was involved with in South Africa with the Office of the Prosecutor, the African Union and some African states. So some of this stuff sort of speaks to them, and it also reflects an article in Journal of International Criminal Justice if you're more interested in read up in this area. So, well, what is complementarity? It's a bit of a buzzword at the ICC. If you look through the Rome Statute, there's no real mention of complementarity as such. Really what complementarity is it's a principle of how the ICC and state parties are supposed to work together. And this contrasts to how the ad hoc tribunals of the ICTY and ICTR worked. The ad hoc tribunals in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia and Rwanda were focused on primacy in the sense that they were established by the UN Security Council, and their jurisdiction for prosecuting international crimes in the territory of the former Yugoslavia or Rwanda meant that these tribunals had first go at any sort of prosecutions. In other words, they had primary jurisdiction, or primacy as it's called, to prosecute international crimes. When it came to the ICC, and because it's an international court, potentially jurisdiction across the world, state parties weren't willing, particularly America, weren't willing to allow that sort of jurisdictional reach, that it would automatically trump states trying to prosecute and investigate these sort of crimes. And this sort of reflects the difficulties with the ICC, that it's secondary to what the primary responsibility is of states to investigate and prosecute international crimes, such as you see under the Genocide Convention or Torture Convention. And so the negotiation in the Rome Statute focused that the ICC would complement, as you can see in the preamble in Article 1 and Article 17 of the Rome Statute, complement domestic processes. And really what this means is that the ICC will only ever investigate where the state party or referred state is unable or unwilling to investigate or prosecute an international crime. So some call this, the court of last resort, not first instance. Some go further in this, saying that the ICC is not a court of appeal. It's only a court of last resort, that victims have no other avenue for ensuring that those who are committing these crimes are held to account. And this reflects wider notions of state responsibility on international law, that under the Rome Statute, state parties have the primary obligation to investigate and prosecute international crimes. And so this quote I've given you in point 4 about striking the balance, that comes from the Court of Appeal. And what you'll see in a number of these cases before the ICC is that the defence or even the state will try to argue that a case or a situation is no longer admissible before the ICC, and so they'll try to argue that it's better for the state to prosecute it. We've seen this in Libya, in the cases of al-Senussi and Saif Gaddafi, where domestic processes were prosecuting them. Also in Simone Bagbo, in Côte d'Ivoire and in Uganda around the Juba peace process talks. And I'll come back to some of those later. Really in those sort of cases, there continues to be a lot of contention, particularly in the Libya and the Côte d'Ivoire cases, to ensure that the ICC can investigate these crimes, because the state isn't properly prosecuting those responsible. Mainly it's prosecuting them under domestic crimes rather than as international crimes. This is the legal basis. So if you look at the Rome Statute, you won't see complementarity as such. You'll see in Article 1, the preamble, that it says that the Rome Statute and the state and the court are supposed to be complementary to each other, and that what the Rome Statute and the ICC represent, along with state parties, is this purpose of ending impunity for international crimes, that together states and the ICC coming together in this way to investigate and prosecute international crimes are going to tackle impunity. I wouldn't say ending, but definitely tackling impunity. Article 17 is about the admissibility as to whether or not a case or situation can go before the court, whether it has jurisdiction to prosecute these sort of crimes. And only in the situations under Article 15 is where a state party is unable or unwilling. And so if you look at Article 17, 1, 2 and 3, you'll see there that what can be seen as unwillingness, such as delays, failure to properly prosecute somebody, the use of amnesty laws, the use of truth commissions to bypass this sort of prosecution, brings into real contention notions of peace versus justice. In other words, that in times of transition where a conflict is ending, it's sometimes better to secure the peace than trying to prosecute the belligerents who are trying to, who are responsible for securing the peace. And it's got a lot of difficulties in Uganda, where in 2006 to 2008, the Ugandan government, along with the Lord's Resistance Army, were in peace negotiations around how to stop the conflict. And so they signed a cessation of hostilities, they signed an agreement on accountability and reconciliation, and gave further details in an annex. And so there was a lot of material written down and agreed to. However, the ICC prosecutor refused to remove the arrest warrants against leaders of the LRA. And the reasons for Marino Ocampo refusing to remove those arrest warrants was the belief that the Ugandan government still had the Amnesty Act 2000 on its statute books, that it hadn't removed the leaders like Joseph Kony from being able to apply for an amnesty, and domestic processes such as the promotion of traditional justice wouldn't ensure that those who committed crimes, both state and non-state actors, would be held to account. And so, unsurprisingly, Joseph Kony refused to sign the peace agreement in Juba and actually killed his subordinate, Vincent Otti, who was leading the peace negotiation. And that was nearly 8 years ago. And so the LRA has continued to commit violence across the whole of Central Africa. In terms of inability or unable, the Central African Republic is a good situation of this. So in 2005, 2006, the Central African Republic saw that the former president Bouzizi being deposed, and he left office and fled into a neighbouring country. The investigations were prompted by victims. They came to the judges, and judges didn't have the capacity to investigate sexual violence or international crimes, and so the case was referred to International Criminal Court, saying there lacked judicial and investigative capacity to prosecute these crimes, and so invited the ICC to come in and investigate. This has happened again in 2013 with the second situation in the Central African Republic, but a lot of these investigations have been frustrated by ongoing violence there. But it just shows the difference between sometimes, like after mass conflict, it's not just that the state is politically unwilling to prosecute these crimes, sometimes it can't. And so in Rwanda, after the genocide, there was only 11 judges and lawyers left in a country of 9 million people. The courts and everything have been destroyed. And if you're ever in Kigali, you'll see the Parliament building where members of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the Tutsi army, were held up during the conflict. There's big shell marks and bullet holes still in that in the building. Moving on then to the distinctions between complementarity. There's two main distinctions that are two forms. One is negative and the other one is positive. Negative complementarity, sometimes called classic complementarity, is really about admissibility, where the court is examining whether or not a case should be investigated by it. In other words, has the state prosecuted these crimes effectively and investigated them? So in other words, is the state unwilling or unable to investigate? So looking at Article 17 in particular. And this can be due for a number of reasons why the state can't investigate. That perpetrators are still in power, that investigations have been delayed or taken too long, which is something which has definitely happened here in Northern Ireland, and there's queries over the investigations into Iraq by British forces. There's also a lack of judicial capacity and or expertise, as in the Central African Republic situation, or there can be blanket amnesties, as in Uganda. Now, at the moment, the prosecutor is examining the situation in Colombia, whereby FARC and the Colombian government are about to sign a peace deal on the 23rd of March, so look out for it. But one of the key things what the ICC is looking at, and whether the prosecutor will move from a preliminary examination to an investigation where the court has jurisdiction, will be whether or not there's going to be amnesties, whether or not there's going to be sufficient punishment for members of FARC and the government who committed crimes against humanity and war crimes, whether or not those truth processes which are being promoted and demobilization schemes for combatants are going to conflict with Colombia's obligation under the Rome Statute to investigate and prosecute international crimes. So it's a big one to watch, and complementarity will be the buzzword around that next week from the ICC's perspective as to whether or not it's going to have jurisdiction, and really whether what Colombia is doing in terms of like criminal law and a bit of human rights is whether it's sufficient, whether it is justice or not. And this is difficult because it forces states to engage with an international court which isn't accountable to anyone. And so there's questions around self-determination of states and state sovereignty versus ICC staffed by judges who don't have the political engagement that the Colombian government has around trying to negotiate this peace settlement with FARC, which after 50 years of conflict has been an incredibly long road. Moving then on to the other side of the coin of positive complementarity. What this is where states take the initiative, and this was promoted by Moreno Ocampo in 2003, where in his policy paper on complementarity, or the role of the prosecutor, talks about that if the ICC and the Rome Statute are really working, the ICC should be working itself out of a job because states would be taking the lead in investigating and prosecuting international crimes. So he talks about a proactive complementarity, a proactive positive complementarity, where the International Criminal Court and state parties cooperate in developing national capacity in prosecuting and investigating international crimes. Now, one example of this would be in Uganda, where over the past few years there's been creation of an international crimes division. And so it's not just that states take the initiative of the ICC and its focus, but judges and lawyers and staff of the ICC will do workshops in country with prosecutors, with judges, to develop their capacity to be able to prosecute these international crimes. It also helps to focus donors in providing money, and particularly the Irish government, the UK government, Netherlands, Norway and Germany and Uganda, providing money to establish an international crimes division and a sort of knowledge exchange. Sorry, that third point is the ICC as a catalyst. Don't know what happened to the rest of that word. In the sense that the ICC, if it's looking at a situation, in order for the state not to lose the cases and to lose its sovereignty over prosecuting these international crimes, will proactively develop capacity. Now, it has and hasn't worked. You know, in Uganda, we've had an international crimes division created. It's had one trial so far, which lasted for 4 hours. I was at it, against Thomas Coelho, and it descended into a legal mess because Coelho was a former commander in the LRA. He said he'd applied for an amnesty, which barred any sort of criminal proceedings. And so for the last 4 or 5 years, the case hasn't proceeded because of this issue of the amnesty. Now, I'll talk about that more after Easter, but for the moment, the case will go back to trial now because the amnesty said it didn't apply to him. And so it's been a very long road to get justice in that sort of case. In Kenya, they've also sort of created an international crimes division, but nobody's been prosecuted for the post-election violence in 2007, 2008. They say there's no evidence. Again, you know, Christopher K. Hall would talk about complementarity being used in a perverse way, and when it came to positive complementarity, that states have the appearance of cooperating with the ICC, but really they're just trying to promote their own agendas and cause delays and play about with evidence to ensure that no trials go forward against their own cadres. Also, a concern with the ICC is, should it really be involved in developing domestic capacity when its mandate is to prosecute international crimes? And so the jury's out in that, but it's something worth thinking about. Is it really the role of a court, an international independent court, to be involved in developing judicial capacity? And then the final point there about, you know, how do you actually develop capacity in a state which has been destroyed. So like in Syria, where cities have been decimated, populations have been massacred or forced to flee their homes, how do you go about building judicial capacity? How do you go about having courts where all the courts have been destroyed or taken over by Islamic State? How do you deal with leaders who are still in power who are involved in the violence? Yeah, and these are not new issues. These were issues back in the former tribunal for Yugoslavia and for the tribunal in Rwanda, where a lot of perpetrators weren't held to account. A lot of perpetrators were still involved in the government, and still threatened and intimidated witnesses. And so there's no easy answers. Maybe it's the best approach that states alone can't guarantee independent, fair trials, and so there's need for an ICC, for international oversight, to ensure prosecution for those people. And so Americans take us a bit too far, but they talk about this justice cascade, that where the ICC starts, it will start to develop national capacity. So in the Congo, the focus on use of child soldiers and sexual violence caused the development of mobile military courts sponsored by the Open Society, whereby judges, prosecutors, defence and victims lawyers would get in the back of a helicopter or a van and drive about the country and hold impromptu trials for military commanders, rebels and anybody involved in committing these sort of crimes. The difficulty was that once these people were prosecuted, they had no money for reparations, and often the security in jails was so weak that the armed group could come in and just scoop the guy out and free him. And so, not a perfect system, but it's all part of this rule of law rhetoric of trying to ensure that there's accountability, and the ICC being the driving force within that. Well, as you probably know by now, that the ICC's got a limited budget, about 123 million euros a year. It's not much. It doesn't have the capacity to support these sort of investigations or provide the conduit to build up national capacity. And so a big part of this equation which is missing is civil society. Civil society plays a big role, both local and international, in advocating and supporting national and international trials. And this leaves civil society in quite a precarious relationship, because sometimes they can't get the funding, that sometimes it tars them as being pro-ICC, and some of their members can get killed. And in other cases, it can mean that other approaches in dealing with the past, more transitional justice approaches, aren't taken into account. And there's a number of theories there is on what complementarity is about. And these stem from debates as to what is appropriate. Like, we're asking states to work with the ICC, but how do we regulate that relationship? And so the first of these is the hard-mirror thesis, that when domestic courts are prosecuting these sort of crimes, that domestically the national prosecutors should be classifying them as international crimes, not domestic crimes. So a good example is the Gaddafi case, whereby he was being prosecuted for a number of minor crimes like murder, cattle rustling, or something very, very minor, instead of crimes against humanity for murdering and executing civilians who were involved in the Arab Spring protests in Tripoli. And so it's what I was talking about a couple of weeks ago in Victims, about characterising the harm that victims experienced, that it wasn't just an ordinary domestic crime. This was politically motivated violence against particular individuals and groups. And this is the hard mirror thesis. The difficulty with the hard mirror thesis is sometimes states don't have prosecutors who are experienced in international criminal law. There may be no domestic legislation for war crimes or crimes against humanity. There's no obligation under the Rome Statute to domesticate the crimes spelt out on war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide in domestic legislation. Some countries do this, other countries don't. So there's a bit of an imbalance here as to trying to ensure that international crimes are domestically prosecuted. This can't always be possible because there may not be no law to do this. In comparison, there's the soft law thesis, that if somebody's been held to account, it doesn't matter whether it's charged domestically as an ordinary crime or as an international crime. Just the fact that it's being prosecuted is enough. But the sophomore thesis says, preferably it's better if it's prosecuted as an international crime, but as long as the person's been held to account. So in case of Katanga, who's been transferred back to the Congo after he's been released from the ICC, he's been prosecuted for committing massacres and crimes against humanity domestically, as well as committing some domestic crimes. And really what the sophomore thesis is saying here is that if somebody's been held, say if somebody's committed multiple murders, if they're charged for each murder, even if it isn't a crime against humanity, the fact that they're just charged and convicted of that should be seen as a success. Now, Heller doesn't completely support this. He says that if you're domestically prosecuting an ordinary crime, it shouldn't be admissible to the ICC as long as the sentence is similar to what the ICC would give to that crime. So in other words, if you were prosecuting murder domestically here in Northern Ireland and you got 10 years, and then if it went to the ICC as a crime against humanity and you would get 12, well then domestically they should be charged at 12 years. The case is though that international criminal courts and tribunals are notorious for being light sentencers. So in Lubanga's case, he got 14 years for using child soldiers. Katanga got 12, I believe, and he's already been released on good behaviour. So it's far less. So this sentencing theory doesn't always work. Dal Robinson builds on Heller's approach, but he argues that we shouldn't just looking at the sentence, at the final outcome. We should be looking at the process itself and how fair procedural rights are within that. Now this takes on more of a human rights approach in trying to guarantee fair trial rights for defendants and for victims. Migre talks about something different. So Frederick Migre says that the ICC is not a human rights court, and the ICC has said this itself. And so issues of fair trial shouldn't be the primary concern. That states should have a margin of appreciation that after conflict they may not have enough defence lawyers or enough judicial capacity to ensure a fair trial. That doesn't mean that it's an unfair trial or a kangaroo political court. What it means is that as long as a person has been held to account for a crime, that should be enough. And so it's too much for expecting domestic courts to meet certain sentencing or procedural obligations. As long as they're holding people to account for these crimes, that's more important. So that's all. There's more debates than that within the field, but that's just to give you a little taste of the issues around complementarity. Now, my approach is to look at it from a victim's perspective, and the reason why I do this is that the ICC is based in part on human rights law, particularly Article 21.3, where the ICC has said that human rights law touches on every single facet of interpretation of its work, including jurisdiction. Now, what's been happening over the past 20 years in the Inter-America and the European Courts of Human Rights is to read in how investigations are supposed to be effective. And one of the ways in which investigations are supposed to be effective is to ensure that victims are able to participate and to be able to submit evidence and to challenge certain parts of the prosecution's charging, etc. And so what allowing the victims to be involved in the investigation and prosecution allows public transparency, because the victims are able to see what's going on, who's being charged, and being able to give their interests be put across to the judges and decision makers. Similarly, in transitional justice, there's been greater emphasis on trying to ensure bespoke approaches to dealing with the past within each country, and that criminal justice by itself is not enough. That other processes such as truth commissions, reparations, demobilisation, lustration should be used to complement quite limited criminal trials. And so from my perspective, there's two aspects to this. The first aspect is looking at it from sort of a negative complementarity as to what is the state doing. If the state is unable or unwilling to genuinely investigate or prosecute a case, what does that mean? I'm not going to look at the due process concerns. I'm more thinking about how can victims be allowed to represent their interests. How are victims and vulnerable witnesses given protection measures? are allowed to submit habeas corpus or have standing to claim proceedings to challenge the prosecutor's decisions that they're charging domestic crimes instead of international ones. And so it's about shedding light on how international crimes are domestically prosecuted. And I've seen this in other cases, like in Hissan Habre, the President Fujimori being brought to the courts in Peru, where these processes are driven by victims. And victims are the ones who are able to speak out and have the agency to find the truth in this and to drive it forward. It also means that there has to be some sort of built-in flexibility, margin of appreciation and implementation for states that in reality you cannot prosecute every single individual. What the Rome Statute seems to suggest is that you prosecute those most responsible. So what does that mean for everybody else? Well, it means that you're going to have to use more innovative processes. And so that's why the Colombia peace agreement with FARC will be interesting next week to see what they'll agree with, to ensure that victims have access, to ensure that FARC is happy that not all its commanders are going to prison for life, and how justice and truth is constructed within that space. Now, a more positive aspect where states are left to do it themselves. What is the ICC trying to do? Well, it's trying to, end impunity and do justice for victims. Very rhetorical and legitimizing work. But at the heart of it, prosecuting individuals is to ensure it never happens again. It's about reaffirming the rule of law. And so in order to get states on board with that, it's about going back to the basics that you studied in constitutional law of the rule of law. That under the rule of law, there's three main principles. Everybody's equal under the law, everybody's equally subject to the law, and that if anybody suffers a breach or a crime or a violation, they have recourse to a remedy under the law. So what that means is that what we're trying to do here by including victims and thinking of victims when we're dealing with these processes is how can domestic positive complementarity approaches be a remedy for victims? Because the victims are the key stakeholders. These are the ones who have been harmed. What role do they have? And for me, this is three components. Now, I know I'm talking about this from a victim-orientated perspective, but what I'm trying to do is to add value to our notions of complementarity in all. That by including victims, it's improving complementarity as well as how we go about tackling impunity. And so there's three components to this. Developing legislation on international crimes, procedural and access to justice, and then substantive. So it's taking on board Heller, Migray, and Robinson's comments on what complementarity is about. First of this is legislating in international crimes. Now, the International Criminal Court will not admit a domestic case if there's no domestic statute on international crimes. They will never do that. It's not a criteria for admissibility, in other words. But like as we talked about, it's important to distinguish international crimes from domestic ones for these reasons, that domestic crimes are very much different from international ones because of these reasons. The difficulty is for monist countries that they'll still need to develop legislation to guide judicial application. And so what I mean here is that states are mostly fall into two groups. When they sign up to international law, there's monoists and there's dualists. Monoists, if the state signs up to an international treaty, it'll automatically become domestic law, which means you don't have to pass domestic law. If you're a dualist state like Ireland and the UK, it means that if you sign an international law, it doesn't become domestically effective until the domestic parliament passes the act. And so a good example of this would be the European Court of Human Rights and the European Convention of Human Rights, which were established in the 1950s. That this only became directly effective in the UK when the UK government passed the Human Rights Act in 1998. So dualist states requires to sign it at the international level and to pass domestic legislation. Now what I'm saying here with monist countries is that even if monist countries they sign up to these international treaties, they still need domestic legislation for judges, because often judges won't be familiar with all international treaties, wouldn't have been trained on them in law school, and so will be very reluctant to apply a foreign treaty if it's not on their domestic statute book, their civil code or whatever, or their criminal code. And this is the case in the Congo, where it's taken a number of years until late last year, early this year, before the Rome Statute was fully domesticated. And so crimes like sexual violence, use of child soldiers, were directly affected in domestic law. And this is the big thing in Uganda. Uganda is a dual state, and so it was only in 2010 that it actually put into law the Rome Statute. The problem with Uganda is that it passed the ICC Act in 2010, but it didn't make international crimes domesticated. And the reason why I say this is that the ICC Act in Uganda only ensures cooperation with the court. It doesn't create any new crimes in the domestic statute book, so it doesn't change the 1950 Penal Code. Moreover, there's crimes like torture, murder, rape, sexual violence, abduction of children, use of child soldiers. These aren't properly characterised as modern crimes under the Uganda Criminal Code. And it's apparent if you look at the Penal Code of Uganda, which is still in the statute books, that torture wasn't criminalised until 2012 under the Prevention of Torture Act. That if you abduct a child to be used as a child soldier, it'll be defined as kidnapping or child abduction. If you commit rape, it's still defined as carnal knowledge. And it's still using very 18th century definitions because the basis of colonialism, the British Empire in Uganda. And so it doesn't really reflect the seriousness of the crimes that are being prosecuted or how they should be properly characterised. And so that's my issue with legislating on these international crimes. You're better define them. The problem is that there's this issue of non-retroactivity, that you can't be punished for the law if it didn't exist at the time you committed the offence. The workaround from that is under Article 15.2, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, 1966, which states that if a crime is recognised as a crime internationally, then it can be prosecuted domestically. But the Ugandan government doesn't want to recognise that. So in the case of Coelho, despite the Ugandan government signing up to the Rome Statute, has been charging him with domestic crimes and for war crimes under their 1958, is it, Geneva Conventions Act, that are very archaic crimes that don't really reflect the international jurisprudence. The second thing is about procedural justice. Here states have a bit of discretion. They can include victim participation. There is no requirement for them to copy the paste the provisions on victim participation in Article 68.3. But as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, this provision is quite ambiguous. It's very unclear as to how this should be applied in practice and implemented. What's important, I think, for any transitional justice process, in order to ensure legitimacy and effectiveness for those who are most affected, the victims, is to ensure effective victim participation and consultation. The ICC gives one vision of how that should be obtained, and I think that there are others as to how victims can participate. In Northern Ireland, we have got the historical institutional abuse inquiry, as well as historical inquests on the Troubles, where victims have participatory rights. They can have their own counsel, they can present evidence, they can cross-examine witnesses. So there's different approaches as to how best to allow participation, and we should allow bespoke approaches to deal with the past. Also, what's important is ensuring effective domestic protection measures. Now, in Kenya, they've introduced a Witness Protection Act, created a Witness Protection Service, but it hasn't really protected witnesses in practice. And so it's a whole notion of perverse complementarity. You're doing it for the sake of being seen. That sort of undermines its effectiveness. The final thing then is about ensuring that victims are informed, about committing to outreach programs to tell victims that these are the processes, these are their rights, this is what they can do, and how they can inform decision makers throughout all these criminal trials, reparations, truth commissions. So we'll come back to this after Easter. But it's about thinking how victims can get their voices heard in processes which are affecting their interests. Moving on then to more substantively, well, after doing all this legislating procedural stuff, what are the outcomes? What substantively are we trying to change? And as we know, criminal trials are limited by the amount of evidence come before them and whether or not the person is found guilty beyond reasonable doubt. What we should be also looking in terms of complementarity is wider processes like truth commissions to how they capture responsibility. I'm not saying it's an either or. I'm thinking of how these other processes can complement criminal trials, because criminal trials will only ever prosecute those where there's evidence against. So there'll only be a handful of people. Truth commissions go to more the causes and consequences of the violence, as we look at groups, institutions like the state, the church, corporations who are involved in committing these sort of violences. And what reparations then do is to try to remedy it, both at the individual and the collective societal level, to ensure it never happens again, as we talked about last week. And so these guarantees of non-repetition are supposed to prevent future victimization by reforming state institutions such as the army, police service, judiciary, to ensure there's better human rights protections for individuals under the law. And all of this really is about rebuilding the rule of law. After the rule of law has been destroyed, how do you go about rebuilding it? And I think, from my perspective, that the ICC, as positive or negative complementarity, doesn't do that. Now, this could be looking and reading complementarity too big. That complementarity is supposed to be the big game changer for states, and that's maybe putting too much focus on the ICC. But also in these sort of situations is that the ICC is the only show in town, that there's no other recourse for justice for victims, that human rights courts won't hear these cases, domestically they can't go to a judge or prosecutor, and so the ICC remains the last resort for justice. And so with that responsibility should come a greater focus that the ICC can highlight these sort of crimes and force states and others to change. But all this has to be balanced with resources. That we can't, the ICC and this criminal justice focus cannot tackle all harm, cannot undo all violations, and it's really just a mechanism and tool for advancing the debate. And so together, victim-orientated complementarity is perhaps a mirror or a foil to reflect what really is going on domestically, not from an institutional international level, from a sort of grassroots bottom-up perspective, where victims are the ones able to see on a day-to-day basis, can they go to a police officer, is there issues of corruption, how do they get to the court, how do they access to remedies, and it gives a better, a fuller picture of what actually is going on domestically when we look at admissibility or positive complementarity. Moving on then to look at how states are actually doing complementarity. Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest with you. There's some progress in many of the situations under investigation by the ICC. There's some innovation, but impunity remains, and there's been little accountability for those who've committed international crimes and little for victims in terms of procedural or substantive justice. And so what I'm going to look at here is these three categories we're talking about legislation, procedural, and then substantive outcomes. And I'm going to look at these four countries in particular of Uganda, the DRC, Kenya, and Côte d'Ivoire. So in the case of Uganda, in 2000, an Amnesty Act was passed, and this Amnesty Act was promoted by the Truly Religious Leaders Peace Initiative, so ARLPI, which were from northern Uganda, the religious and political leaders and traditional leaders, they all wanted to ensure that children and adults who had been abducted, tens of thousands of them, by the LRA could return home to Uganda without fear of prosecution. And so this Amnesty Act was passed, which was a blanket amnesty, which allowed anybody who was in rebellion against the state to come forward and to claim the amnesty and not face any criminal or civil liability. All good and well, and we'll talk about that more after Easter. In 2010, to coincide with Uganda hosting the first review of the Rome Statute in 2010, they passed the International Crimes Act, which just ensures cooperation between Uganda and the ICC. Also around the same time was the creation of the International Crimes Division, which is part of the High Court in Uganda. It's based in Kampala mainly, in Côte, but it's also had sittings in Gulu. And its first case was against Thomas Coelho, pictured in the green there, where his trial in July lasted a few hours in 2011 before it was postponed pending the amnesty issue. Now that case is supposed to resume. But what also has been going on in the International Crimes Division over the past while is prosecution of members of Al-Shabaab who were involved in the Rugby World Cup bombing in Uganda in 2010, November 2010 I think, or November 2011, where 86 people were blown up. And it's beyond just international crimes. It also looks at terrorism, child trafficking, and other criminal acts which go beyond just domestic crimes. Also, what's been happening is that the jail laws, which is supported by the Irish government, the justice, law and order sector, has been developing a transitional justice policy, which is currently in its 6th draft. It hasn't been released, but how looking at broader issues of doing transitional justice in Uganda beyond just the International Crimes Division. And saying that, the International Crimes Division had a massive loss there in this time last year, where Joan Kigezi, one of the lead prosecutors at the International Crimes Division, who was prosecuting Coelho and Al-Shabaab, was gunned down in front of her home a couple of days before I was to meet her again. And Joan, was one of the leading female prosecutors in Uganda who had a lot of expertise in international crimes, had worked a lot with the ICC prosecutors and judges, had been at numerous workshops and programs, who had a lot of knowledge in this area and was one of the first people to start prosecuting crimes against humanity and war crimes domestically. And her loss was a big blow for the International Crimes Division and any sort of transitional justice in Uganda. And so that's a difficulty with these sort of situations, that sometimes it's not just institutions you're building, but also what capacity you're developing in people. Other transitional justice things, like in Uganda, I can talk more about this after Easter, but it's been very long. Coming up to the election this year, President Museveni's been apologising for certain acts and giving money to certain victims groups, but it doesn't amount to a coherent reparations policy. Moving on to then the DRC. It's had an international crimes bill brought before its parliament a couple of times, and only late last year was it actually passed, that put sexual crimes domestically effective, so judges could interpret them based on what was stated in their own statute. Even though it was a mono state that as soon as the Congolese government signed up to it and passed the presidential decree, it became domestically effective, it was important to have the international crimes in the penal code so that the judges and prosecutors could read it and work off their case and build their cases around it. Now, this has been clear with the mobile military courts, which have been running for the past few years, past 5-6 years, which go about the country prosecuting these sort of individuals. And there's been a lot of innovation here. There's been reparations ordered for victims. There's been these innovative protection measures on quite cheap rates. So, like sort of gown, or having a victim sit in a separate room with a microphone where they're cross-examined. It's found joint responsibility of state and militia groups for committing atrocities in order to convict them accordingly in order to pay reparations between the two. However, victims have a very limited role in how they participate. Individuals are able to break out of prison and no reparation has yet been paid in these cases. And so the Redress Trust in London is bringing the Congolese government to the African Court of Human Rights on this basis, that they haven't offered victims effective redress. And that all said, beyond these just very select few cases before the military courts, there's no other way victims can have access to justice. So the vast majority, there is no justice. And there's no way to prevent continuing atrocities being committed by non-state armed groups and by the army on a daily basis in the Congo. So legally speaking, there seems to be advances, but in practice, impunity still exists, and people who commit these crimes continue to do so. In Kenya, we've seen the International Crimes Act, similar to Uganda, being passed, which transposes the Rome Statute into domestic law to ensure cooperation. We've also seen a Truth Commission created in Kenya, which gives quite extensive recommendations on how to deal with the post-election violence, but it goes beyond this. It looks back from the 1960s until now as to how to deal with all the past violations. And it's got a number of innovations, like I mentioned last week, in terms of reparations, but all these recommendations remain on paper. The government hasn't implemented any of them. What it has done is create an international crimes division similar to Uganda, but nobody's been prosecuted for it yet. There was over 4,000 cases that were going to be investigated by it, but they were all dismissed en masse, saying there's no evidence. There was one case that was supposed to go forward against a police officer who killed an individual during the post-election violence, but again, that hasn't gone forward. There's real concerns over witness and victim protection. Numerous people have been killed and disappeared, and others have been bribed, and it's very difficult to ensure accountability for these individuals. If you're interested in reading more, look at my chapter 6 in my book. It discusses this in more depth, and that issue of non-retroactivity, that even though these international crimes have been passed domestically, states are unwilling to prosecute crimes in the past before this legislation was brought forward. So non-retroactivity for international crimes. In Côte d'Ivoire and the Ivory Coast, on the face of it, there has been some good developments. There's been a National Committee of Inquiry set up, Truth Commission, a special investigative cell within the prosecutor's office to look in these sort of crimes. But out of all of this, there's been very little for victims. There's been some show trials for former members of Gbagbo's regime. Samine Gbagbo and 82 other supporters were convicted last year, as were others such as General Bruno Dogbo-Bale, and it sort of represents victor's justice. Now, one member, Adame Umereri, he was arrested for committing a massacre in Western Côte d'Ivoire a number of years ago, but he is yet to be prosecuted and convicted. And so what you see here in Côte d'Ivoire is Ouattara, the current president, trying to maintain support in his party and his side by prosecuting the other side, Gbagbo's forces, yet doesn't want to upset the boat by prosecuting his own cadres, his own generals and supporters who got him into power. Now at the ICC, something similar has been happening where they've only focused on Gbagbo's forces, and so this year, or in the last couple of months, the prosecutor at the ICC, Fada Bensouda, has said that they're now looking at prosecuting pro-Ouattara forces. And so it's this notion of sequential investigations, that they started off investigations in Côte d'Ivoire, focused on Gbagbo, and then looking at Ouattara. The difficulty is for victims that, there's 5 or 6 years difference in these investigations and timelines, and at the end of it, it does feel unbalanced. And so then we return to this issue of perverse complementarity, that's what Christopher K. Hall talks about, that when states are trying to develop domestic prosecutions and investigations for these crimes, they're really just serving up the lowest of the low-level perpetrators or rebels who don't really affect political power within the state. And what this does is reinforce impunity. That even in Darfur, they created a special court, which hasn't held anybody to account, but states can legislate and create all these courts all they want, but it doesn't mean there's accountability or justice for victims. Similarly, in Libya and the Central African Republic, there's ongoing insecurity and violence, that trials that may be held, like in the case of al-Zanussi or Saif Gaddafi, you've got militias who are grabbing them. There was one case of al-Zanussi's niece or cousin being kidnapped by a militia for her own protection as a witness against him, and so there's a real concern about fair trial rights within that. And so although we've talked about that Robinson's arguments about process shouldn't be taken into account, there's real queries about the fairness of trials and the outcomes of it if states are able to manipulate how witnesses are brought forward, how people are protected, and what rights defendants have. Like in the case of Libya, those defendants like Saif Gaddafi and Al Senussi haven't had access to their defence counsel, yet they've been convicted and sentenced to death. And so what does this mean for the ICC? What does it mean for international crimes divisions and how they're supposed to prosecute these international crimes? It's very difficult. But in terms of domestic capacity, there is some positive signs already, but there's very few prosecutions and even fewer convictions. And this may reflect that sometimes it's better looking beyond just trials. There's a real political unwillingness to ensure accountability. Sometimes because they can't in the Central African Republic or Libya, but there's real methods by the states, as in Kenya, to frustrate justice and truth for victims. And so what's needed is greater focus by the international community, not the International Criminal Court, the international community and civil society, to encourage states to ensure justice for victims. And the politics around this is a nightmare. That this impunity is allowed to continue, which ultimately undermines any sort of legitimacy or progress within the state, and just reinforces victimization, that they deserve to suffer this harm. And so what we'll look at after Easter is transitional justice, about trying to ensure local ownership. And so pictured here is some photos when I was in Rwanda of the gachachas or reconciliation groups, which are trying to build up links between communities. And this includes a different number of processes. We've talked about some already, like reparations and truth commissions. But it looks beyond just individual responsibility to look at how crimes were allowed to proliferate within a state, how was it causes, who is responsible, what was the role of the media, the state, judges, lawyers in these sort of crimes. But there's difficulties of impartiality. So in the Rwanda gachachas here, these domestic community courts, the Rwandan Tutsi government didn't allow them to look at crimes committed by the Tutsi army. It only focused on the Hutu genocidaires. So there's a question of impartiality and whether it's really political expedience and whether victims' needs are really accommodated within that. And so the difficulty for complementarity is that it's got responsibilities to, the ICC's got to ensure that relationship between states, that it doesn't overreach, that state parties do all the heavy lifting when it comes to international crimes, investigations and prosecutions. But in reality, that is not happening. We have not seen it happen yet. We haven't seen the convictions that should be coming. The ICC has only got 2 convictions so far, and that's something similar to what 9 or 10 countries before the ICC have. That's very, very little. And victims in this whole equation are very much left outside in the cold. That there's no space for them in negotiating or being consulted in what complementarity should look like. And I think that goes against what human rights law states. Now, what I suggest now is the role for other actors. There's been a lot of rhetoric around the African Union, and this is focused on the Malaba Protocol, which you can access here. Malaba Protocol was agreed in 2014, whereby, in 2012, whereby states, Kenya, Sudan, were getting very frustrated at the ICC in indicting sitting heads of state. And so what they said is that the ICC is targeting Africans. What we're going to do is create our own court to deal with these sort of crimes. We can deal with these crimes ourselves. And so within the African Court of Human Rights and Justice, created an international criminal law section. However, it's probably unworkable because it allows heads of state to be immune. It doesn't usurp the ICC. The ICC still has jurisdiction. It's supposed to be a sort of mid-level court that those who aren't heads of state could be prosecuted. But it's prosecuted for a range of crimes. And it's a question of whether this dilutes the seriousness of the crimes when people are being prosecuted for trafficking in hazardous waste or piracy. Is that really the same as genocide or crimes against humanity? Probably not. However, there's been a lot of rhetoric around this, and the African Union, some representatives saying this would be signed. I remember in 2014 saying we're going to have everybody signed off by next month, where they need 15 signatures. it's 2016, and then you have 5 countries who support it, and 5 countries which have really bad human rights records: Kenya, Benin, Congo, Brazzaville, and Guinea-Bissau, and Mauritania. You know, not the stalwarts of human rights, are trying to ensure the best rights for their citizens. So what better role can the African Union play? Well, I think they should be trying to encourage cooperation between states, that even if there is an international criminal section, it can promote reparations, it can give an additional avenue for justice for victims, provided it's not the head of states. But there is problems here, that it could overpromise and not have the capacity to meet the needs of African victims. It doesn't really have the same provisions for victim participation, victim standing, and its provisions on immunity aren't just limited to heads of states. It can also be other designated government officials. So effectively, it's looking at all the rebels and losers of a conflict, and non-state actors, in other words, that is going to allow immunity for a state and state forces. And really, it's sort of muddy in the waters. That really, when it said the ICC is a problem when it comes to targeting Africans, that's not correct. The state is the problem, because the state is supposed to have primary jurisdiction to prosecute these sort of crimes, and it isn't doing that. And really, when you look at regional courts like the European Court, the Inter-American Court, or the African Court particularly, they don't have the resources to do these sort of massive investigations. And I've included this diagram here to show that there's a patchwork of what African states actually sign up to. There's 34 signatories of the Rome Statute, which are African states, yet only 26 have signed up to the African Court, and so it's very, very little, you know, in comparison. That if they were so behind the African Union, more would be signing up to do this, and so, you know, there's a real gap of accountability. There's a lot of rhetoric and very little action, and it's probably more appropriate that. But I think that the victims should use the African Court of Justice and Human Rights to enforce states, African states, to investigate these crimes domestically, and to enforce their obligations under the Rome Statute to prosecute these individuals. And so the Kenyan cartoonist here kind of was put this cartoon that this is what the African Court's going to look like. It's going to be all the people who are speaking out against dictators. And it's not going to be full accountability. And I think more generally for state parties under the ICC Rome Statute is that they should be developing genuine national proceedings. They should be engaging more in capacity building, knowledge exchange and funding. And then where states aren't cooperating, where states are not properly investigating and prosecuting these cases, that the ICC, instead of initialising jurisdiction and taking the case onto itself, should be referring it, these sort of cases, to its political body made up of states of the Assembly of State Parties. And if they're not doing anything, then other states, like in the Belgium and Senegal case involving Hiss and Habre, taking those states to the International Court of Justice and arguing that they're breaching the Rome Statute by not fulfilling their obligations therein. And also, maybe another perspective is that complementarity isn't vertical between the state and the ICC, that there's maybe more horizontal between states, that states are supposed to encourage cooperation and compliance with each other. So there's a lot in that, and so to really conclude, we're trying to work out what's the best system. How do we really tackle impunity? How do we best encourage states to investigate and prosecute these sort of crimes? Is the ICC the best pivot for making all this happen and all this stuff to go around with? And really what we're seeing with the International Court of Justice is that recognising that domestic trials aren't enough, but we need the international with the domestic in order to make sure a long legacy. And I think in the future, the way the complementarity needs to go to ensure its legitimacy and its practicality is to engage more of transitional justice and how it can fit in with transitional justice processes. So that's something, hopefully, which will give you a good introduction to complementarity. If you're interested in the essay question on it, read up, look at the journal articles. I've picked out some in the reading. There's a whole lot more. Look at the case law, and particularly the Libya case law, and read around the issue because it's complicated. After Easter, we'll speak about more transitional justice aspects of this and how this can be accommodated with a wider notion of justice and how do we try to end impunity, or at least tackle it beyond just criminal trials.